we always put a liner of clay, but that only is as strong as the particle that's in there. Anything can happen to that. So that's not a guarantee either.
You know, I don't think the design is complete at this point, but I know one of the things that was done as far as the process is to talk to some of the contractors who would do that type of work, and they have equipment that has like a cage protector on the mixer that would keep it from getting close to the liner and causing damage. So that, I understand your concern. I believe that's part of the consideration in how it will be done.
If the liner's already ripped, it's already ready to replace it. Somebody, you're probably not going to even have to hit it with whatever machinery he's got. When you put that weight in there, you mix all that up, turn it into a liquid, what do you have? It doesn't take somebody with an engineering degree to figure that out.
Well, when the material is stabilized, it takes a week, 2 weeks for the stuff to really get to that strength. But there's going to be a period of time when the material's curing. That's true. We got the liner. They're going to take precautions to make sure that doesn't occur. But if it were to occur,
What precautions?
The mixing equipment that would be used for the stabilization, we talked to several contractors about how it could be done. And using a special protective roll cage around the end of the mixer, so the mixing equipment's not actually going to come in contact with the liner. It's going to be kept outside of that. And so as the material cures and starts to stabilize, it's going to be effective at getting that material stabilized relatively quickly.
We're not talking about the equipment. We're talking about the current condition of the liner and the weight that's going to be put on it.
Right, and I guess what I would say is we're really not counting on that liner being a way to protect against future migration. What we're looking to be protective is actually stabilizing the material into a solid with cement to create a solid, and then covering with a low permeability liner on top of that, so that a cover system, so that as the rainfall comes down, it's not going to be able to get into that waste material. It's actually going to be run off to the sides, run off to the side slopes. So you're not going to have water being generated and going down through that liner, even if there were to be some sort of a separation in the liner.
So you're saying if the liner's ripped, whenever it's all mixed together, before it's solid, it won't leak?
We're saying when we did our evaluations, we did not take credit for that liner being a part of the final protective system.
The liner is in their equation.
So the liner's not even in your equation. So if there was no liner there, and this was just a big pond full of these muds, you do the same thing.
Well, if it was mud, you have to have a liner system in place because it's got free water that could actually come out of the pond and migrate. But once the stuff is stabilized into a cement, that's the potential for that to happen is not going to occur.
Talking about before it's stabilized. So you're missing that point.
But I hear what you're saying, but while it's being stabilized, when the material is stabilized and the equipment is working over a portion of the liner, it's going to stabilize fairly quickly. Within.
You said 2 weeks.
Well, it's going to set up 2 weeks to get to its full strength, but within a few days, it's going to actually set like when you would mix cement.
So in essence, what you're doing is you're taking a semi-solid mass, turning it into a solid mass, and you're saying because of that, it's not going to migrate. It's not going to get into the water system.
We're going to need to, when we do our final design, what this mix for the cement's going to look like to add to the material. We're going to have to make sure we've got a mix that's going to create a solid mass that's not going to look strong.
What about deterioration of the
Well, it's going to be a solid starting out. It's going to be a solid, as cement would stay solid over time. It's not going to be exposed to, well, sure, but it's going to be buried. It's going to be below 4 or 5 feet of soil. Most of it more than that. It's going to have a protective cover over the top to keep water from infiltrating it. So it's not going to really have an exposure path to that cement to break up and break. It's going to be slow.
Where did y'all conduct y'all's testing on these ponds?
Of the sludge?
On these ponds? When did y'all conduct the testing?
That was performed in 2009. The sampling.
2009?
The sampling.
I've got a couple questions. First, now just so I understand, and I'm going back to the beginning of what you said, the reason that you're claiming an exemption from RCRA from this being declared a hazardous waste, which would require you under the law to treat it differently, is because of the concentration level is below, did you say 300 parts per million?
In regards to that, the testing shows the material is not hazardous for RCRA. However, all the closure steps that we are proposing to do would be done we are complying with RCRA closure requirement.
But isn't uranium, wouldn't that be like an F-listed waste at certain concentrations just due to its toxicity and heavy metal?
Uranium would not be. No, uranium would be regulated by the NRC. Is a reason for that.
Okay.
But the testing showed that the pond material is non-hazardous, which is part of the evaluation, was not RCRA hazardous, which is part of the evaluation done to see if closure in place would be viable. However, you know, we even told, say, the EPA who would be evaluating things for RCRA, hazardous waste side of things, told them, you know, it's non-hazardous. However, we're still complying with whatever RCRA requirements that the EPA requires us to comply with. We're, you know, complying with those. We're not trying to say we've done this testing and it's magically non-hazardous, therefore we're not going to do this, that, and that. We just said we've done the testing to show it's not hazardous, but we're still going to do what you would require a RCRA facility to do.
I mean, you know, one would be tempted to say that, I mean, I remember hearing on the news, and maybe it's been a couple years ago, and I've heard a little scuttlebutt around the community about an FBI raid and a grand jury in Metropolis having to do with mislabeling of RCRA materials. And when you're saying, well, this isn't RCRA material, and so therefore we can do what we want with it, one would, you know, I don't think one would necessarily be irrational to greet that with a little skepticism under the circumstances. Because of everything that probably, I mean, I know from having been involved in the original RCRA permit back in, I don't know, it was 87 or something like that, and we had a hearing on it, and you know, I commented on it, and there's a lot of barrels of other stuff other than just uranium that's stored out there, and some of that is RCRA materials. And I mean, I just have a hard time believing, considering that this goes back to the, you know, the 50s, and the kind of environmental carelessness that a lot of the facilities around here practiced, that sludge at the bottom of those ponds is just pure something, you know, so that you can just brush it away. And you know, you can easily, if you don't test for particular chemicals, they won't show up. And so if you don't, you know, if you don't test for them, then it's easy to say that, well, they're not there. So, you know, I mean, I would want to know what all you tested for first, you know, before I would be able to believe. And you know, then you know, it's obvious you're contractors with the company, and you have to submit all this stuff to the company, big shots, and they're gonna scrub it and give it to you and tell you what you have to say to everybody at one of these meetings. And so, you know, we're getting that version of it. And, you know, I know from, you know, I sat as chair of the CAB over at the gaseous diffusion plant for 6 years, and there was a lot of RCRA issues with that, and this whole idea of blending waste in order so that you can average out to come up with a level that's below the RCRA trigger, that's really not in compliance with RCRA. So, I mean, I'm a little concerned about the way that you're manipulating the process and the paperwork in order to make it seem like that it isn't hazardous waste and that you can deal with it on this on-site. So, I mean, that's kind of a concern. And then my second question is, one of the things, you know, when I was chair of the CAB, we had a scientist from the Central Midwest Earthquake Consortium come up and give us a whole night's worth of presentation about the New Madrid rift and the seismic risk. And, you know, Paducah, for example, which is basically right across the river, is in the, well, it's kind of right on the border but you know, it's either in the zone 9 or zone 10, which are the two highest risk zones. And the way that you know, they know, they've studied this a lot. They've gone to New Madrid and in some of the bottomlands around here, and they've drilled these cores. And they find these, when there's these big seismic events, like a 7 or 8 point, they form these, what they call sand blows. And it forces sand up like a fountain. And they can go way down in the ground and find these sand blows, and then based on how much dirt there is between these sand blows, come up with a sort of a rhythm for how this occurs. And they have an estimation of that the one that's equivalent to the 1811, 1812 earthquake comes on like a 250 to 400 year cycle. And so, you know, we're about 200 years in. And, you know, that's a real, you know, earthquake science isn't real exact, but we're talking about materials. I think it was spoken about the half-life of these materials is a lot more, you know, whether it's 1 million, 10,000, 1,000, you know, we're talking about you're going to be having to store these materials for a number of years. And what is the seismic rating on these covered containment facilities that you're going to stabilize? I mean, or what's going to happen with an 8 point?
Well, I can tell you that, you know, the design we've put together has taken into account, you know, the fact that we're in a high seismic zone. In the New Madrid, as you point out, an event like the 1811 event, you don't know that something like that couldn't happen again within 10 years, 50 years down the line in the short term. Could happen. Could happen soon. And so our design has taken into account that, you know, something called a 2,500 year earthquake, if that were to occur, that our design would still be stable and that the cover system would still be intact and that the you know, slope stability would stay and would maintain its integrity. And so it's a really high earthquake, you know, obviously because of the history of earth seismicity in this area. It's like, you know, a really high acceleration called 1G, you know, it's basically a horizontal acceleration that's higher in this area than it is pretty much anywhere else in the U.S. except for California.
Well, but see, that's hard to believe because, I mean, I've looked at liquefaction maps in this whole region, and the liquefaction soils are all on the river bottoms. And when there's liquefaction, you know, that's like taking when you have wet sand in a jar and you shake it up, you know, and it turns into a slurry. And that's what these liquefaction soils do. And you don't think that the bottom is just going to fall out and that these covers are going to split. And I mean, I don't know. And that's the one. And I do believe, you know, and it's a real struggle with me on a philosophical level, because I believe that a community should take care of its own waste. And it really isn't really right to dump on other communities. But it's a real dilemma when we have these really long-term toxic materials that are in the river bottoms of one of the major rivers of the world, and we have these seismic threats, whether it's really an appropriate place for long-term storage of these kind of materials. I think it's a legitimate question.
It is a legitimate question, certainly. And, you know, under the pond, or around the pond, there's been a number of investigations over the last 20 years plus, you know, as to what the conditions of the soil are like underneath the ponds, adjacent to the ponds. And we looked at all that information when we were putting our design together. I can tell you that of the boreholes that were advanced right around the pond area, we went all the way down through into the very, very dense sands that are below the depth and the zone that could potentially liquefy. So we've got profiles all the way through there, and it indicates that in most cases, all the soils are very competent materials. And there's one location where it's probably as competent, but we're going to investigate a little bit more as we finalize our final design. And, you know, we've taken that into a lot of consideration, and we've, you know, it's all in the application, by the way. If you ever want to look at that in more detail, the whole description of how we evaluated this.
Well, that's a whole other issue. Like I was talking to you before, you know, I mean, I asked for a copy. I was told I could get an electronic copy of the